So we're going to get started. This is our last session, but it's a real treat. We have superb speakers. The first one is Dr. Jocelyn Silvester. She is a pediatric gastroenterologist and a scientist. So she serves as a research director of the Celiac program at Boston Children's Hospital. And her research involves the diagnosis management of celiac disease, and she's been really a national contributor and one of my personal favorite researchers. You can see it's the end of the day. I'm like taking a little liberty. Okay.
Thanks, Alan. I hope that the gluten-free donuts are getting to you too. So we have a little bit to talk about here, which is great. And that's actually why I have disclosures, because you actually can't disclose if there's no drug companies developing drugs that want to talk to you. But the equally important thing is a research support. And I'll notice that one on the bottom, National Institutes of Health. I'm so delighted that there's a budget and that they can still fund us. So pay your taxes. It comes to these things. It's good for everybody. And I will discuss some gluten detection technologies very briefly. But mostly I want to talk about what would a drug for celiac disease do and how would we know if it works and what are we going to need from everybody to make this happen? And it's a partnership. And what's missing on that slide is you, because we can't develop anything without patients. So this is the global debut of the glutenometer. Which is something that's critical to everybody. And this is the thing we do every day is, well, if we went on that Sydney Haas banana diet, it's probably 100% gluten-free, but it's not really a lifelong diet, right? That croissant over there made out of gluten looks really good, but that's not the answer either. And so we're kind of stuck over here towards the banana, but we know there's some skeletons in our gluten-free cookie jar. So what can we do to solve this problem and get us over here or actually treat those skeletons? And so that's really the two approaches to drug development. One is to make the gluten-free diet more gluten-free by treating residual gluten. And the other is to allow a quote normal diet, which would be a gluten unrestricted diet. And then you can imagine there's everything on the spectrum. And this is a really important concept because we don't have a drug for celiac disease and we really haven't gotten very far in testing them yet. So we don't actually really know what these drugs are capable of doing. And so people put up these slides a lot. And a lot of it is hand waving and make believe. This is the intestine. You can see the columns of cells. The croissant is in the lumen where the food is. Those yellow dots are gluten. If you eat gluten, it gets digested by the TTGs, which are the blue bits, and then it gets into the body and recognized by the immune system, which is over here on the right. You have this immune reaction, and on the very bottom, you can see that HLA-DQ2 presenting to that T cell, and we think that's really critical to celiac disease. So obviously, each of these steps along the way, we could make a different target. And there's actually a target that I can't really even put on here. That's a whole other field I won't talk about, which is there's a serious effort going on to genetically modify all of the sequences in gluten so that you could have wheat that doesn't actually have the gluten peptides that people with celiac disease recognize. But these are all drugs in the traditional sense, which we have a little bit of a better idea how to figure out if they work. So this is the pipeline. And as you can see, it's encouraging because there's lots of hits on target. We know most drugs will fail. You can see as we go up, there's some that are in phase 2. Phase 3 is the final phase before approval. So we're not just testing things for humans for the first time, which is phase 1. The ones that have a croissant beside them are the ones that are potentially pushing us over to that end of the glutenometer. And as you can see, there's some drug companies that you've probably heard of, which is exciting because it's a lot of effort in many ways to get these to the finish line. So we can sort of roughly group these drugs into 2 categories, and that's how they're being tested, and that's how we'll talk about how we'll get there. So one of these drugs is a TTG inhibitor, and this kind of gets back and pulls together some of the things we talked about earlier. So Javier talked about genetics and genetic susceptibility, and that DQ2 and DQ8 present the gluten, and then you can have it recognized. Now, most people with celiac disease most people with those genes don't get celiac disease. So there's some trigger, which is what Dr. Leonard has been looking for. Once you have your celiac disease triggered in people who have those genes, then gluten is the driver, which means if you put gluten in, people have more active disease. If you take gluten out, they have less active disease. And what's really fascinating is that gluten sticks better to DQ if TTG chops a little piece off of it and changes the charge, which is what this picture below is showing. And TTG also has another property where it can link itself to itself and link itself to gluten. And so this is part of the reason why you get those deamidated gliadin antibodies first, and then you get the TTG antibodies. And so what this drug does is it inhibits TTG. And the idea here is if you can stop the TTG from making the gluten bind to the DQ, then maybe you could stop celiac disease. And so this is happening in the lumen, which for those of you who've been to a lot of these talks is one of the things that sort of shifted in over the pandemic, is that we now think that the deamidation step happens in the lumen and not after you cross the epithelial barrier. So we have this drug, which sounds fantastic, but how are we really going to know if it works? And so that's why we do clinical trials. And most clinical trials for most conditions, but not celiac disease, you take people who are sick. You have some criteria because you want them to have some certain properties, and then you randomize them. Are they going to get the drug? Are they going to get placebo? You treat them for a certain period of time. And then at the end, you have some endpoint you're going to measure to figure out how many people on the drug got better and how many people on placebo got better. And if more people on the drug got better than placebo, you attribute it to your drug. And so there's some really important things that are happening here in terms of how one gets involved in clinical trials. So the first thing is screening. So there may be some things, for instance, some of those trials, they want people who are DQ2. So your genetics may be a reason that you get screened. Age is another one. But what are we going to do in celiac disease? Because most people with celiac disease, well, they may be unhappy. They're not vomiting on a gluten-free diet. And so this is one of the things that makes it very difficult, because if you take patients with celiac disease, most of them would probably describe themselves as generally well. So then how do you know if your drug works? And so, they're also on a gluten-free diet, which we've talked about a lot. This is our doggy bag study. So on the top is the folks who don't have celiac disease on a gluten unrestricted diet. And you can basically see there's lots of signal because they're getting lots of gluten, but not every single meal. And then on the bottom 4 rows, you have those people who were on a gluten-free diet where we detected signal. And what you can see is that there's signal, but it's variable. And this is really a sense of, where are folks on that glutenometer? Some are closer to the banana, some are a little bit further away. So when you're thinking about a drug for celiac disease, if we take people off their gluten-free diet, then a lot of them are going to get sick. It's a lot to ask. And we don't really know if our drug is good enough to replace a gluten-free diet, which means that we now have multiple variables and we somehow have to control for them. And it's really almost impossible to know where somebody is in terms of their gluten-free diet adherence. And there's some randomness to when gluten might get in and how much. And then to further complicate things, we're supposed to approve drugs because they make people feel better, but a lot of people with celiac disease don't think that they have a lot of symptoms. So what they did in this study was they decided, okay, we'll keep everybody on a gluten-free diet, and then we'll try 3 different doses of the drug because we don't know what one works, and then the rest will get placebo. But then how do we know if the drug worked? Because we have everybody on a gluten-free diet and now we're giving them a drug. And so we're going to look at the intestine because we think of celiac disease as an enteropathy, but we expect people to be healthy on a gluten-free diet. And now we're just giving them a drug to make them more healthy. And this is where we really go back to Dr. Leffler's talk at the very beginning of the day, and this whole idea of defining celiac disease and bringing out celiac disease. And so this concept that used to be used for diagnosis, that there's this gluten responsiveness. Once you get triggered, then you're gluten responsive. So if you have somebody on gluten, they're not going to look very well. Take it away, they'll look better. And we're able to flip that back and forth with celiac disease, which is a super powerful tool, which is part of the reason why we have these targets, because we're further ahead than most other autoimmune diseases where they don't know what the driver of the disease is. So in this particular design, they decided to put in 6 weeks of a weekly gluten challenge, which in this case was actually a cookie. And so this is another way of looking at that same study design. And I really wanted to bring your attention to the bottom just to make the point that most clinical trials are the same. If you're somebody who's hearing about clinical trials and wondering what that actually means to participate in clinical trials. So there's some period at the beginning where we try and sort out based on all of the criteria if you are if you can be included or not. And then randomization is when you're included, and we flip that coin to figure out what group you're going to be in. That's usually with a visit. And then we usually follow you up along the way. And then there's a visit where we do the endpoint. And then there's usually a late follow-up visit just to make sure everything's okay. And that variation gets repeated. So this trial was a landmark study, and it was actually in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is a first for celiac disease. And you'll notice the first author here is Detlef Schuppan, who's the person who actually discovered that TTG is an autoantigen for celiac disease. So it's come full circle. And so what they found is when you look at the histology, there's two things you can look at. One is how high are the villi, and the other is how many inflammatory cells are there. So on the left is looking at the villi. And for those who are in the back, the blue is placebo, and then the other colors are the drugs. The yellow is the highest dose. So you can see the people on placebo, their villi got shorter. The others, they stayed about the same. And then on the right, the people who got the highest dose didn't have much more inflammation, and then the others, it increased. So this is suggesting that maybe there's some hope that this drug might be able to enable some gluten to creep into the gluten-free diet. And this is part of the reason why that question that was posed to Dr. Chang about, well, what if I eat gluten once a month, once a week? What's the threshold? We don't know. And part of the goal of drugs is to change and move the threshold, even if we don't get to the holy gluten grail. Now, of course, the devil is in the details. That looked very pretty because it was the averages. This is if you look at the individuals plotted. And so you can see the actual data is a little bit more messy. And this is part of the reason why we need more people, is so that we can get more signal, so we can be more certain about what's going on. Now, there's another type that is the type of medication for celiac disease that's maybe the most exciting. And that's because these are medications that we've never really had before. So a lot of the trials in celiac disease, it's this quote, first in class. And that's because these medications are targeting the immune system, but pretty much every immune drug we have, be it steroids, be it Humira, be it Remicade and anti-TNF, is trying to suppress the immune system. And it's kind of a very, sledgehammer approach. These medications aren't necessarily trying to suppress the immune system. They're trying to take those T cells that get unhappy when they see gluten and re-educate them so that they tolerate gluten and don't get angry, so that there's no reaction. And so 3 medications that fall in that category are CAN-101, TAC-101, and DonQ52. And you can see here that this is happening internal once you're inside the body. And so CAN-101, I'll talk about. I won't talk about all of them just for time. This medication has a few cool properties. It's based on knowing that really for the immune system, what's really important is context, because you see all sorts of food in your intestine and you have to tolerate that, all sorts of bacteria you have to tolerate. And so depending where you see the signal, that helps affect how you're going to be primed to react. And so in the liver, there's a way you can present proteins that primes you for tolerance. And so what this drug does is deliver it to the liver in a way that it takes these cells that get activated and it starts to switch them to pathways which are not activated T cells. And we can talk about that in more detail later, but I think that's the key point from the T cells. And so for this drug, what we're really trying to do is induce tolerance. So we're trying to tweak the immune system, which means now really the fundamental question we're asking is not, are these people getting better or not? It's, is the immune system responding? And this is where we heard earlier about NextVax and that there's different ways of assessing immune response. So DQ2 again presents antigen. It's recognized by the T cells. And so what happens after this? If this is really this key thing that suddenly now we see there's gluten there, how does that T cell respond and what does it make happen? So this is a study that we did with our colleagues at Mass General, where we took adults with celiac disease on a gluten-free diet, and we didn't have any drug involved. We just gave gluten because one of the things we've realized in trying to figure out how drugs work is we need to learn more about what happens to people when they eat gluten, because we really focused on the patients who are undiagnosed and how we recognize them. Now we need to look at a little bit more subtle things. So we took folks, and it's a so-called phase 0 study because there was no drug, and they either got 3 grams of gluten a day for 2 weeks or 10 grams of gluten a day for 2 weeks. And we looked at a whole bunch of biomarkers because we just wanted to see, okay, what correlates with what? And you can see our first measurement point was at 4 hours, which is when we had people having symptoms. And we also had a rise in IL-2. And we actually had to wait later to see some of these biologic endpoints, like villus atrophy. And that those really were dose dependent. So we were seeing more biological damage in the end organ in the intestine when we were at higher doses. And this is the whole idea that there's a dose response to gluten, which I think people who have celiac disease are very familiar with. So what we learned here is that after a T cell eats gluten, it spits out IL-2, and this happens within 4 hours. So this is the first block is the run-in visit. The second block is before the first dose of gluten, which we observed on day 1. They either got 3 grams on the left or 10 grams on the right. And then 4 hours later is that big peak, which is the IL-2. So this is a beautiful, immediate way to see if there's a response. And you've only given the person 1 dose of gluten, which is really critical because a huge part of trying to develop drugs is trying to make sure that we can learn the most with the least inconvenience to patients. And so this is looking at correlations between that IL-2 response and other measures that we had, symptoms. VHCD is histology, IEL is those intraepithelial lymphocytes, which are the inflammatory cells. And so you can see that really actually IL-2 at 4 hours correlated better with those later biological outcomes than it did with symptoms, which is not surprising because we know that symptoms are super variable, and they're probably not all mediated by IL-2, but vomiting seems to be highly correlated. So this is the marker they used to test their tolerogenic drug. And this is a phase 1 trial. So typically, if you're developing a drug, phase 1 is kind of the most important and the scariest because it's the first. And so this is the first in human phase. And so this is all about safety. And typically these trials are done in healthy people who don't have any disease because we just want to see what happens when you put this compound in humans, because so far it's only been given to laboratory animals. Now for celiac disease, because we're looking at a response that only happens in people with celiac disease, giving the drug to healthy people is much less relevant because it doesn't give us as much information about safety. So many companies have been actually testing their drugs for the very first time in people with celiac disease. And that is helpful because then we can potentially get some information. So this was a phase 1 classic single ascending dose trial to try and figure out what dose, what happens with different doses to pick a dose for that phase 2 study where they actually look at outcomes. But because they had people with celiac disease, at the end of the study, they could bring them back and they could actually do that IL-2 test. And so this is how they actually looked to see whether or not their medication was working. And so on the left is IL-2, which is really a much more sensitive way of doing an interferon gamma ELISpot, which is another way of looking at T cell activation. And what you can see is on the left and in both plots, the first column is the placebo group that didn't get drug. They had a response, and then there was really much less response in the other groups. And that there was different doses and a little bit of a dose response, perhaps. Now, what's really cool about this medication is that they did that after 2 weeks, and the dose actually disappears within hours. And so this is really exciting, and we don't really know what it means, but it's telling us that potentially if you educate a T cell, maybe it actually learns and it remembers, and maybe that will last. So there really needs to be more studies to understand this. And so I wanted to switch a little bit and talk about, okay, this is very exciting. It would be amazing to have a treatment for celiac disease. This is phase 1. Most phase 1 drugs don't make it to phase 2. This one is. And then most don't make it to phase 3. But how do we make these drugs? And Dr. Leffler talked about the biggest challenge is having people to come forward and participate in trials. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things we think about when we're designing trials. So the most important thing is how much gluten is needed. And since we're taking treated patients, it means that there has to be some gluten. If we want to make a drug that allows people to eat gluten, we have to show that it's safe and it works when people have gluten. And so the question is exactly how much gluten do you need? And this is where there's probably some treat to target and where these companies are sort of separating out. So one option is if you have people who are already striving to be gluten-free, who have intermittent gluten exposure, then maybe you're just trying to get rid of cross-contamination. And so this is where something like a glutenase enzyme, an enzyme that breaks up gluten so it's no longer toxic, that's where those are being positioned. And then on the other side, you have these medications that actually change how the immune system is responding, so that potentially then you would be able to have a more unrestricted gluten-free diet. And so this is sort of a look again at our doggy bag study. So what we did here was we took the adults with celiac disease and the non-celiac, and we basically just tried to measure how much gluten was in their urine and stool and food to get some idea of how much gluten there is. And so if we're looking at people who are going to be those celiac group that are trying to follow a gluten-free diet, then if they're continuing their gluten-free diet, there's some sort of baseline signal. But in order to understand what's going on with the drug, we have to put some sort of signal on top of that. And so in these studies, often the gluten is intermittent, not every day, and a relatively small amount of gluten, knowing that the less gluten we give, the less likely people are to have symptoms, and that that's highly variable. And so you can sort of see this trace gluten because that's what we're trying to simulate and to treat. Now, if you want an alternative to the gluten-free diet, this is where there really has to be more gluten, and where you're more likely to be having gluten that's in a more palatable form. And so in terms of what we've learned from trials, we don't have a drug yet. We have a lot of shots on target, and we're getting better and smarter in how we test these drugs because people have come forth and volunteered to help us learn. And so one of the things we learned very early was that actually villi grow taller just by being in a clinical trial. So the reason we need that placebo group and why there's sometimes a placebo drug, placebo gluten group is that just knowing you're in a clinical trial makes people kind of shift a little more to the left on their glutenometer and be a little bit more strict in their gluten-free diet, even though the only intervention is that we're watching them in a clinical trial. And so that we learned is very important. We're also trying to figure out, how much gluten, how long, what are the thresholds for damage? That's how we came up with 20 parts per million, finding biomarkers. And then one of the things we did in this study with Mass General, you can see on the bottom is we actually used these pill cams to try and assess how much damage there was. And you can see at the beginning, there wasn't a lot of damage. Day 14 was the end of gluten challenge, and most people had damage. But then by day 42, which is going to be about 1 month after day 14, you can see that the amount of damage is much less. And this was really exciting because this is actually giving us data on how people heal. And so this is suggesting that people on a well-controlled gluten-free diet who get gluten heal relatively quickly. And there's not actually a lot of data on this because it's hard to get people to do lots of endoscopies, but that's why we need them. So why volunteer? Why eat gluten when your doctors and your dietitians spend their lives telling you not to eat gluten? I think this is a special case because this is actually not a benefit to you because croissants are enjoyable. This is a benefit to the whole community of people with celiac disease to maybe get closer to eating those croissants. And so if we want to eat croissants, people have to come forward and see what happens and if this drug can actually be protective. We know, and I just showed you data, that gluten-induced damage is reversible, and this is why the FDA lets us do gluten challenge studies. We also have a very stringent selection process. Part of that is self-selection. People who are very symptomatic typically don't come forward, but we also have criteria based on different things, who's eligible. And then the amount, of course, is going to vary, and we often have options to either treat symptoms or down dose. And you often get to learn more about your own disease because some of the measures that we're doing, we can actually share with you. So you might learn your genotype, you might get a follow-up biopsy, and it's exciting just to be part of developing something. And we will learn something even if the drug fails. So I just wanted to put in as a last thing before Dr. Leitner pulls out his hook, some shameless promotion for a trial that we're currently doing, because one of the questions I get asked in clinic all the time is, well, when are drugs going to be tested in kids? And I push really hard for this, but a lot of these things are being worked out in adults because kids are maybe just a little bit more precious, but it's coming. And so what we really need to do is understand, well, how do these tools we're using in adults work in kids, and does it really translate? And so we're doing a study looking at that IL-2 response in children, because to date, all of the data is on adults. And so we want to confirm that it's the same in children's, because children have slightly different relative populations of T cells. And we also want to know if children need the same amount of gluten. And then we also are seeing, all right, we can take that person, we can get them to eat gluten, and we can see what happens to their IL-2. What if we take that person's blood, expose that person's blood to gluten, and see if it then spits out IL-2, because we know those T cells are circulating in the blood. And so this is what we're doing. We're currently recruiting. Feel free to talk to me, or you can email us at Celiac Research, children's.harvard.edu, or join our research registry. But we're looking for children with celiac disease. We're looking for their siblings who might want to come and do it at the same time and see if their sibling vomits. And we're also looking for adults with celiac disease, so you could also see if your mother vomits. So it's a great study. And a lot of interest has actually been from teenagers who are diagnosed when they were very young, who are not really sure what's going to happen when they have gluten. Now, we spend a lot of time thinking about these things. And so we've really tried to pick a lower dose of gluten. So we really honestly haven't had anybody vomit, and we're about halfway through, which is great because we don't want to have people vomit for science. But if you're interested, then please do reach out. I wanted to give a shout out to our team and our lab and the folks who actually make all of this happen by paying for it. And here at the bottom is the link to our research registry, Solve CD. So it's the first place we look for people for studies. Thanks.
I'd like to thank Dr. Silvester. We're going to be switching gears now and hearing about what's evolving in the gluten-free food industry, which I'm very interested in. Our speaker is Meghan Donnelly. Meghan is a registered dietitian and the senior nutrition manager for Schar USA. She's had extensive experience in both the healthcare and food production industries. And in addition to her work at Schar, she is the chair of the Dietitians in Gluten and Gastrointestinal Disorders group through the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. Thanks, Meghan.
Thank you so much. So just before we get into this presentation, I'm going to kind of talk about a few different things, the industry as a whole, what the market looks like today versus years ago, and then also talk about some labeling things from a manufacturer's perspective. Prior to becoming a dietitian, I did work in a quality assurance lab. And so I worked at a major food company, and I was doing a lot of this testing myself. So I have a lot of background in this, but I'm not a food scientist, so I'll do my best to explain some of it. But I think that helps me in my job as a dietitian, really understanding what you can ask a manufacturer, how to ask it in a way to get a real answer, and just some of the background information as to why some things might be a little harder for people to answer. So I work at Schar, is my disclosure. All right, so looking at the market, the gluten-free market is growing, which is a really exciting thing. I pulled SPINS data on this, which is the main food industry database. And it looks like about 10 years ago, we had just under 400 products available in the US, and now we have over 3,000 products available. So that is great. There are a huge number of products now, and hopefully they're not as hard to find as they used to be. I think, the sad shelf for gluten-free is kind of a changing thing, I hope. And I know in a lot of areas it's a lot easier, but it continues to grow every year, and you'll see some of that. So this is just an overview. It's a little bit of an older data set, but some of the sales growth on free from claims. And gluten-free does get it gets looped in with a lot of the allergen claims, but you'll see across the board, they're growing is the point. The percents don't matter. It's just every kind of free from claim is growing industry-wide. And so is interest in the gluten-free diet. So this is a Google Trends slide, and I think this is interesting because it shows how people are searching for gluten-free diet. There's a lot of ways you can look at this and compare the data, but I just did general gluten-free diet. Interest really has spiked around 2010, 2011, and it continues to grow. So as we grow awareness of celiac disease and the gluten-free diet, it seems like more and more people are starting to take the time to learn about it and educate themselves. But as we know, online information, there's a lot of misinformation out there, right? So hopefully I can kind of answer some of those questions for you. The gluten-free market is actually huge. Right now, it's sitting at about $7.1 billion globally. But we expect that to continue to grow up to 8.3 billion by 2025. So this is a huge industry. And I think people are somewhat skeptical of food industry as a whole, but you know, as a dietitian, I try to put in context, you know, there's a role for certain things. And of course, we want to focus on naturally gluten-free foods, but you know, it's a benefit that there's more availability of these products and that people are able to access gluten-free foods that are safe more often. So, you know, it's a balance. And of course, an industry is an industry, but you know, it's a good thing that it's growing and it's just providing more access for people. The largest categories are bread, snacks, with salty snacks, and cookies. So we have some of the growth in 2022, but just overall in the United States, these numbers are really big, right? These are large markets. And, you know, a dietitian, I have to address the elephant in the room is that, you know, manufacturing processed foods, right? They're not as healthy in general than whole foods. You know, gluten-free foods specifically get a lot of criticism for being higher in sugar and fat and lower in fiber and a number of other things, especially micronutrients. That is changing a little bit. I couldn't find data on it, but if you just kind of look around at some of the products, they are getting better in terms of their ingredients and their nutrition profiles. I tell people, you know, look for things that are high in fiber, especially when you're looking at a bread or a pasta item or a cracker. And then as low in sugar as possible. That kind of applies to any processed food, but they are starting to become more similar if you compare them nutritionally, especially as some of these general better for you products also happen to be gluten-free. You're going to see some cleaner labels. So that's a good thing. All right, so manufacturing. So when we talk about gluten-free manufacturing, there are actually more points that are required than typical production. You know, you have to think about where your crops are grown. Are they grown near fields where wheat is processed or, you know, mills where wheat is also processed? If you're a dedicated gluten-free company, you're taking that into account. There's also the testing piece. So when raw materials come into a facility that is producing gluten-free products, you're going to have to test all of those raw materials for the presence of gluten and other allergens. And we'll get more into that in a little bit. There's also the production line. There is testing that happens on the production line of almost any product that's made in the United States. Quality assurance teams are swabbing to test for the presence of these things. At least they should be very often. You know, we check packaging. You can't test packaging for gluten, but you can check the ingredients in it and you can check that there are no defects in it that could potentially expose that product to some pathogens or other allergen or gluten or something like that. And then there's transport. I mean, things can happen in transport, but, you know, one of the things that I think is kind of interesting is that that's actually a quality assurance measure too. And how things are transported across the world is actually very tightly regulated. So these are all points that manufacturers have to think about. And when you're adding the gluten-free layer or other allergen layer, it just becomes that much more complicated and takes a lot more work to kind of verify that things are going well. Dedicated gluten-free facilities is ideal when you have celiac disease. You want to look for products that are produced in gluten-free facilities if it's possible. This is not 100% required, right? We know that this is not always happening in large companies. They have multiple products in multiple areas. My main takeaway is if you're looking at a product that's made by a dedicated gluten-free company, very often they're produced in facilities where there is no gluten, and that's great. But when you come into situations where that's not the case, what is the appropriate question? And that's kind of what I want to talk about, because there are procedures put in place to prevent allergen cross-contamination and gluten contamination. So while this is, of course, ideal, it's not always possible, and that's not a problem. I don't think people need to be searching for products that are only produced in dedicated gluten-free facilities, but there are some that are. So testing. This, I think, is an interesting one from a quality assurance perspective, and standard practices kind of vary. So the gold standard method for testing for gluten in the food industry is the ELISA method. There are two types, and to be honest, most of us use the sandwich ELISA method to test for the presence of gluten. I don't do this testing, but I can tell you that majority of companies I've worked for or spoken to are doing multiple ELISA tests daily if they're producing a food that's certified gluten-free. Testing requirements, they vary, and we'll talk about the testing requirements in a second, but for the most part, this is something that people are using, and a lot of gluten-free manufacturers specifically will do it both in-house and they'll send it to an external lab for verification. So this is a good question to ask. If you're not sure about a product, call the manufacturer and ask what testing methods they're using, and they should be able to answer pretty readily. This is an easy one that I think most of them are prepared to answer. And labeling. So we had a great presentation about labeling earlier, and I'm going to kind of spin that into some of that information into the manufacturer's lens, because it is a little bit different when you're dealing with it from the back end. So the FALCPA law, the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act, requires manufacturers to disclose major allergens on food labels in plain language. And there are 9 allergens that are required in the United States. Of course, barley and rye are not required to be declared on allergen statements, but they will be in the ingredients list. As we heard earlier, sometimes there's hidden names for these ingredients, and that's really where the dietitian education comes in. As it relates to allergens, in my experience with the food industry, is that swabs are being done pretty frequently. Every manufacturer has to be able to show that they have a preventative action plan for the cross-contamination of allergens. Every company's plan will look a little bit different, but they have to be able to show that and be prepared to show that to the FDA should they show up at their facility. And the FDA does randomly show up at facilities, and you have to be able to provide appropriate documentation, and you have to show them that you have a plan to prevent allergen contamination. So while this is not a perfect system, I think it's a good thing to ask a manufacturer if you're calling and you're questioning something, what are the plans you have in place in order to prevent contamination? Also, the precautionary allergen labeling, we talked about this before, but I want to kind of say what it really means. I mean, these may contain statements are very complicated. They don't mean the same thing in every company because they're voluntary. So what I tell people to do is, of course, read ingredients every time you shop. You don't want to make a decision strictly based on a may contain statement, right? Because it might be a risk for cross-contamination. It might not be. But you can call the manufacturer and ask. I'll give you an example. The sesame labeling changed recently. Sesame got added to the top allergen list. So now there are top 9 allergens instead of 8. And, you're seeing probably a lot more products that you didn't know may contain sesame, seeing this may contain sesame statement. What does that really mean? Where in the production process is there a risk? And if you call a company and they can't answer what the risk is, it probably means they're not really checking for it, or it's, so far down the supply chain that they don't really want to make a statement about it. But I know that if you call a company that has a really good allergen management plan in place, they will be able to call and tell you, well, we think it's a risk in the agricultural production process, or, there's sesame also in the facility. So this is where, it's nuanced. I think good questions to ask. How do you clean your equipment? Do you batch test for allergens or gluten? How are your raw materials sourced? How do you avoid cross-contamination in the facility? If they have a good allergen plan, they will have answers to those questions. And if they don't, then maybe you don't want to risk consuming that product. But this is very individualized. And I wouldn't recommend just looking at a label and seeing a may contain statement and making a decision based on that. It really is nuanced depending on the company, the product, where they make it, the rules where they make it. It just really varies. So call and try to have conversations. They should be able to answer you. And this is, What does gluten-free really mean? It's a concentration that has been determined to be the acceptable standard to be called a gluten-free product. A question that I get a lot, a few times a month, is how many parts per million in one slice of your bread or your crackers? And, as for the dietitians in the room, you're probably cringing, but, from a dietary education perspective, this is a really important point. It's not an amount per serving. It's a concentration over, the whole product that has been rigorously studied to be determined as safe for the majority of people. So that's, when you're looking at a product, you don't want to say, oh, how much of this can I have before I reach the 20 parts per million threshold? It is different, and it's an important education piece that it seems like a lot of people are missing, unfortunately. And then certification. So there are a number of certification agencies that certify products. They do their own testing, their own auditing process, and companies have to pay them to come in and do this. All of these certifications that I have here, these are, there's probably more. These are just the ones that I see the most. All of them represent certification for less than 20 parts per million of gluten. The FDA does not endorse one particular certification. So for example, I'm going to go back. If you see, the first one I have there with the intestine, that's probably the most common one that you see in the United States, but it doesn't mean it's superior to one of these other ones. If you're calling a product gluten-free, it has to be less than 20 parts per million. And that applies to some of these products that are not certified by an independent agency. A certification body does give you a little bit of a peace of mind, right? Someone else is checking that company to make sure they're following the rules. But really, if the product says gluten-free on it and isn't certified by one of those independent third parties, technically, they are still supposed to be following the same rules. So don't be afraid of a product that doesn't have a recognizable certification. Maybe it's a certification you just aren't aware of, but you can always, again, call the manufacturer. They should be able to tell you what they're doing to be able to claim gluten-free. And then wheat starch. I bring this up because I think I get a lot of questions about this, and we did talk about it earlier, but what is wheat starch? So remember, gluten's a protein, and there's more than protein in wheat. So wheat starch is made from the endosperm, which is primarily a starch. And what they do is they dissolve the starch portion in water. It's water soluble. They do some food science, and they turn it into a fine white powder by dissolving the water. And in order to get a gluten-free certification on a gluten-free wheat starch or a product that has gluten-free wheat starch, you need to rigorously test to make sure that it is free from the gluten protein. So, questions, again, things you might be able to ask a company about their gluten-free wheat starch. How do you test to make sure your wheat starch is safe? The best way to know is that they are using both ELISA methods. Most companies I have asked a lot, most companies are using both ELISA methods to test that the wheat starch is safe. And they will also have this disclaimer on pack that says the certified gluten-free wheat has been processed to allow this food to meet the FDA requirements for gluten-free food. If you call a company, they most likely will have this answer prepared for you. But it's just good to know, what language should you be asking? And it's really, how are they testing? All right, so now for the fun part, the future of the industry. So there are so many trends in the gluten-free space right now. I just kind of pulled in my favorites. I hope, some of these things actually come to fruition because they'd be really cool. So first of all, artificial intelligence. This is kind of infiltrating every industry, right? But for ingredients, this is actually being used to kind of develop formulas for recipes using ingredients that, maybe aren't widely used within the market yet. So I don't know how many companies are using this. We use a data set from Mintel, which is really the food industry trends data source. And this is what they say companies are doing to innovate new products and find new ingredients. From a nutrition perspective, we're focusing on better for you products as a whole. As a dietitian, I feel very strongly about this, reducing some of those bad ingredients, the additives, sugar, too much sodium. I think some of the front of pack labeling is kind of driving this. So you're starting to see some things that are labeled like healthy, or in other countries in South America, they're putting kind of like a nutrition score on the packs, which can, be helpful. And then also sourcing of ingredients. So interestingly, sustainability is it's a really hot topic in the gluten-free world. Actually, I think a number of reasons are driving that, partially because a lot of these things are provided in a lot of plastic. And so when you can use upcycled ingredients, or you can change the packaging to be more sustainable, that's, we're seeing it a lot in the trends. Like I said before, the better for you trend is, I think, here to stay. It's interesting. And, with gluten-free manufacturing specifically, I go a little bit back and forth on this. Not everyone wants their gluten-free cookie to be, a health food product, and it shouldn't be. A cookie is a cookie. But, as much as these things are possible, we want to make the diet healthier, closing the gap between gluten-free products and gluten-containing products. So, as a dietitian, I like this trend, but, within reason. And then fiber. Anyone who knows me as a dietitian knows fiber is my favorite topic, because it's the key to health. And fiber, the use of fiber in gluten-free products is really changing. And finally, many of these products are not so low in fiber, and, many times they're comparable or higher in fiber than their gluten-containing counterparts now. It's something I feel very strongly about. So luckily, Americans are focusing a little bit more on fiber for health. I think as this gut health trend kind of comes into play, people are embracing fiber finally. But, that causes innovation too. And oat fiber is an emerging fiber to watch. Now, I picked this one out specifically for this community because I know oats are a little bit controversial. So again, if you see this ingredient in a product that you're consuming, call the manufacturer and ask, what is their protocol? How do they source their oats? Are they testing them? Are they making sure that they're not contaminated? Are they buying from a supplier that's also doing that? It's not a problem if they're adding it. It's just maybe some more questions are warranted as long as you tolerate oats. And so just my closing statement is that gluten-free products have improved so much in the last 10 years in terms of texture, taste, and variety. And they're available everywhere now. And if you don't have a good assortment in your grocery store, there are so many online retailers now that have them. I mean, all of the major grocery chains are kind of playing in e-commerce now. So just, they are available. You just have to know where to look for them. So thank you.
So thank you all for sticking with us through the day. We're so excited that so many of you are still watching online and in the room. And we are very, very, very excited to end the day on a food topic with a very awesome chef. Joining us today, we have Chef Ken Oringer. He is a James Beard award-winning chef and founder of JK Food Group. He owns and operates highly acclaimed restaurants around Boston, including Italian-style Copa, Spanish tapas restaurant Toro, and the global-inspired Small Plates restaurant and Raw Bar Little Donkey. In 2022, he opened Fascia of Fascia, a coastal Italian restaurant, and his first new concept in 6 years. Ken has received numerous awards and recognition for his work, including garnering the Star Chefs Rising Stars Mentor Award in 2010 for his dedication to teaching and inspiring the next generation of chefs. His daughter was diagnosed with celiac disease in 2020, and in 2023, together they released a cookbook called Cooking with My Dad, the Chef. So welcome, Ken, and I hope it's okay to put you in the hot seat and ask you some questions about your experience as a chef. I'm going to start with some questions, but feel free to come up to the microphone if you have others that you would like to ask. So what inspired you to have gluten-free menus in your restaurant? Were they there before your daughter was diagnosed, or did they come after?
Funny because this is working.
I think, no.
Not really. Okay, there we go. Okay. It's funny because just prior to, not just prior, but a couple years prior, we at the restaurants kind of made a decision. My wife had been pretty much gluten-free, not celiac, but had been eating gluten-free for a number of years. And I myself, when we were home and would go out, we're pretty much eating gluten-free for health reasons. And we decided to kind of challenge our chefs to make the restaurants gluten-free without people really knowing about it. And we just out of creativity and using a number of different ingredients. And luckily, a lot of our restaurants, we have a Spanish restaurant, so we use a lot of rice. We have Italian restaurants that we are able to play around with gluten-free pastas and cook a lot of proteins in the wood oven. And with Little Donkey, our global small plates restaurant, we were able to really utilize food from, like India or from, South America or other areas where they use lots, or Mexico, where they use lots of corn or rice or quinoa or whatever. So it's something that I was very comfortable with. And then when my daughter was diagnosed, it was a pretty easy transition to move into that.
How do you make sure that you avoid cross contact in your kitchens?
I mean, that's still keeps me up at night. It's really difficult. We have a lot of small kitchens in our restaurants, and it's constantly training everybody on a daily basis, and not even on a daily basis, but just watching every move that they make, like being a detective and making sure that we have our containers all separated. We have our utensils, we have our pans, we have our ingredients, and it's really requires a lot of diligence and a lot of commitment from our chefs and from our team of really explaining, again, as you guys have been talking about, how dangerous it really is to cross-contaminate somebody. And a lot of these people don't have that knowledge, and it's really a lot of education.
Can you tell us about a challenge you face when making some of these recipes gluten-free?
I mean, it's funny because when we were testing the cookbook, it was during COVID, and pretty much during COVID, when we had a lot of time on our hands, as did a lot of people. So and our daughter was diagnosed just prior to COVID. So I literally tested recipes every day for 12 hours a day for years. And that's why my wife came up with the idea to write the cookbook, because every day I was thinking about what dishes would my daughter miss and what dishes do I really need to create so that she will never really miss anything. And it was it's funny, I told people it was like being like a Buddhist, because it's such having to reteach yourself how to cook when I've been cooking by instinct my whole life, and having to start over again and measure every gram of everything that I was cooking, and having failure after failure, and rolling out pasta and it's sticking in the pasta machine, where I'd never had anything, happen to me in probably 25 years of cooking, where I didn't understand why the pasta was sticking and how do I adjust it. And so it was lots of tinkering and lots of experimenting, and it's such a lesson in patience. And again, it was so beautiful to really be able to finally have everything in print, that, again, all our recipes have been tested by, we did this book in collaboration with America's Test Kitchen. So all our recipes were tested by hundreds of kids all over the country. And it's nice that we have a legacy of this gluten-free cookbook with recipes that we guarantee will work no matter what.
So there's a lot of patient families watching. There's also a lot of health professionals, dietitians and doctors and nurses watching. Even for planning of today, we told the hotel, everything has to be gluten-free, but we guarantee that people are going to come and say, oh, but I also have a dairy allergy. I also have a soy allergy. How do you handle all of these requests in the restaurants? And what are ways that we can advise our patients and to the families listening can be better customers when asking for special accommodations?
I mean, being a chef and restaurant owner, the easiest thing is when you make your reservation to mention allergies. And nowadays, with the open tables and the Resis and these incredible databases that we have for reservations, we have guest notes on a daily basis. So we know going into each day of service that there are going to be a number of allergies, but nowadays, I mean, probably 50% of our guests have allergies, and it's just something that we have all our menus and all our new dishes that we put on. We document, and we have allergy journals, and we have certain menus and ingredient lists that we're able to. If somebody comes in and has a dairy allergy, we can pretty much, the server will come right up, and we have a protocol at all the restaurants where the server will come right up when people order with questions and come right up to the chef and ask the questions. You know, we have menus, but we double check everything, and we'll say, well, can they have the, tuna dish with a dairy allergy? Say, yep. Can they have the, the pasta with dairy allergy? And we double check and say, yes. So every single allergy, every single guest, every single order, we double check at the pass with the chefs. And, so we can guarantee. And then when we drop it off at the table, the server or the runner will say the same thing. Here's your tuna with a dairy allergy. Okay. And, we constantly work on all these allergies.
So when you get the reservations, if someone types in that they have celiac disease or whatever the allergy is, do you get like a summary of that for the day, or how does that information? It always feels like it just goes into cyberspace to me.
No, we'll go over those at a pre-shift where the chefs and the front of house wait staff and managers will say, okay, we have 6 reservations with celiac disease, we have a number of dairy allergies, we have blah blah blah, vegetarians, and so just to put in the mindset that but pretty much every night is nowadays, again, at any restaurant, are going to be loaded with allergies. It's just the new norm.
So I know there's a lot of turnover in restaurant staff. How do you handle the consistent needing to train your team?
That's that's the craziest, but again, it's nowadays it's all part of the job. And we basically will have our recipes, everything. Before, we used to allow things more cooking to feel, but now we have everything is grammed out for our base recipes. There's no improvisation. There's no chance for anybody to go rogue and say, you know what, and in this sauce, I'm going to throw a little bit of flour in it, or I'm going to throw a little bit of this or a little bit of that. Everything is pretty much a standard recipe that we follow on a daily basis, and just train, again, new hires just how to do all these and how to just make sure everything's consistent.
So we're in October now, and we're coming up to Thanksgiving, and I'd like to talk about the desserts that you guys do for Thanksgiving and all of those gluten-free deliciousness. My family was very excited to eat all of them last year. They were like the best desserts that we've eaten. How did you create all of them, and how did you select the products for them? Was it a ton of testing? How did you get there?
It's a combination of all the above. I mean, first off, I'm lucky enough that many moons ago, I was a pastry chef. So pastries are something that I've always had a love for. And my wife is an amazing baker. I mean, who doesn't love desserts? So it's just something that, and I found, again, with the gluten-free transition, that desserts are, and we're actually opening up a bakery and cafe in probably about 3 or 4 months in Cambridge, called Vervan Cafe and Bakery. So all you guys need to come check it out. It'll be 100% gluten-free. And but we're not advertising it as being gluten-free because of that reason, again, that I've been able to work with some amazing pastry chefs and partners and people that were able to create. Even this morning, for my wife, I made kind of a coffee cake, walnut, like an almond cake, coffee cake with like walnut streusel topping with mochico flour and some brown rice flour and tapioca starch. And just, it's a sour cream coffee cake. So once you understand, again, some of the science involved with how you can make a cake that, because if you're going to use, say, 50% of almond flour, and if you're going to put 250 grams of sour cream into a cake, and you have some mochico flour in there, which is going to give you that little bounce, odds are it's going to be a really nice texture, and it's going to be a delicious base cake that you can use, and then you can improvise from there and put, the crumble topping, or put caramelized apples, or put, whatever. But it's just something that it's about balancing the textures and flavors, and trying not to make something which Schar has been able to master, which I still have a hard time with, is making things like croissants or pain au chocolat, or the puff pastry type, which they've mastered at home, can still be very, very tricky. So I would recommend using Schar for all the puff pastry type stuff, and you can make the tarts and quiches and things like that. But for cakes and other things, I think that's the easiest route to go.
So you mentioned that you collaborate with other pastry chefs, that I know you have relationships with lots of them. Have the conversations about the gluten-free diet changed over the years with other chefs in the industry, or are they still like, is there some sense of annoyance still with it?
I mean, some chefs are a pain in the butt. I mean, there's going to be annoyance, and all you guys know, you're living, this celiac life. It's it's frustrating. I mean, we still see it all the time. But one thing that again, as Meghan just mentioned, more and more people are obviously, gluten-free now than ever, and are going to continue to move in that pace. And I just had a conversation with the head of marketing worldwide of Starbucks a couple weeks ago, talking with him about having more options for, for gluten-free, because, they have like one little tiny thing, and it's kind of a joke. And, and in Europe, they actually have a lot more. And I know Schar in Europe has a much larger presence, but it's something that, I explained. I was like, listen, it's like, I have a teenage girl who would probably be going to Starbucks every day, with her friends, and it's limited. I don't understand why you wouldn't start doing more R&D in this field. And they agreed, and they said they're committed to definitely doing more in the future, and it's on their radar. But I think that a lot of people are starting to understand this as chefs and as business people in the food industry, and I think they'll continue to. But with restaurants and other places, where to go eat, I mean, I've always gone to the fallback of, if you go to a great restaurant, or the chef has won certain awards, or is committed to using local ingredients, or organics, or things like that, odds are they're going to understand that you're coming in with a celiac, and they'll definitely embrace the challenge of wanting to make great food that you can have a great time, because nobody wants anybody to come to their restaurant and leave, number one, sick, number two, complaining. With all the forums and everything, nowadays, the last thing you want to do is be dealing with people like that.
Absolutely. Well, Ken, thank you so much for being here today, for sharing your recipes and wisdom. And I have lots more questions for you in the future. So we hope to see you again at another event.
All right. And again, if anybody wants to cook the best gluten-free recipes from a cookbook, again, this book is 100% gluten-free, and Cooking with My Dead Chef, you can buy it on Amazon or any of your local bookstores. So, all right. Thank you.
So that's it. We ended 12 minutes late. My apologies for that. I want to again thank the speakers, some of whom are still here, for fantastic talks. Our sponsors, particularly our three major sponsors, Celiac Disease Foundation, Schar USA, and Takeda. I'd also like to thank the exhibitors. I hope that you had a chance to see them. Also to thank all of you, the participants, both here in person and online. And special thanks to Francie and the Celiac Kids Connection, and to Vanessa, without whom this would not have happened. All attendees will receive a survey, because we want to do it better next year and really address all your needs. The continuing education attendees have a different survey that they have access to that needs to be completed so they can get their certificates. Yep, there. You can see that there are QR codes that are shown. And there will be recordings of this session that will be available over the next few days via the Zoom events site. If you need any help accessing this, please email us at celiac@childrens.harvard.edu. Would I forget, Vanessa?
Thanks for coming. We'll see
Thank you. Have a great rest of your day. Go Patriots.